Hi everyone, my name is Will, and today we're going to take a look at Jenkins and Kestra and look at them side by side to figure out which one is best for different use cases. I want to look at a handful of different use cases. To start with, I want to have a look at testing in these platforms. How easy is it for me to run my tests and also get the information I need from those? Following that, once our code has been tested and we're happy it works, how can I easily deploy that, both onto the instance itself, but also run and deploy it on the cloud and be able to provision resources automatically. After that, I'd love to add alerting in so we can keep an eye on what's going on and get told in real time when things are not going right. To add an extra layer to that, let's add version control in. How can I easily manage this with Git? How can I manage the workflow's revisions? And how can I easily integrate this with my repository? After that, how can I automatically run my workflows and my pipelines? How do I trigger these executions to be both on a schedule, but also event-based if that's what I'm after? And then the last thing we'll look at is plugins. Both what's available, but how do I manage and install them so that I can get exactly what I need for my use case. Let's jump in and have a look at what there is. When we first boot up Kestra, we are presented with this wonderful dashboard here. Now this gives us some really good insight into what's going on. I can easily see how many things are successful and failed. I can see it over time, which can be really useful for spotting some weird things. And I can scroll down and see a lot more detail as well. All very, very useful. Now, when I open Jenkins, I get a similar sort of view here with the dashboard. As you can see here, I can see my 3 different pipelines and I can see whether they were successful and any descriptions that I added. But this is sort of all it provides you out of the box. Now, you can obviously configure Jenkins to do a lot more things if you want and connect to other platforms. But if you were to spin up Jenkins, this is what you are presented with straight away. You also have the option to open this Blue Ocean platform as well, where here I can see sort of an overview of my pipelines too. A little bit nicer, you could say a bit like the Kestra dashboard, but again, I would say Kestra gets the win here for giving me useful information right at my fingertips. Now let's jump into creating a workflow. Now inside of Kestra, I can do that simply by clicking this create flow button. Now the way Kestra thinks is everything is a workflow effectively. Anything you want to configure is effectively a workflow. So this makes it quite easy for different things. Now if we start off, I press create and here I'm presented straight away with an example flow. And I can go in here and immediately start editing by typing in different things and the autocomplete here will jump in and take over. And as we can see here, I've created a very simple workflow here called Hello World, and it's just going to print Hello World in Python. I can now press execute, and we're going to see that easily run with this really rich Gantt view here that shows me exactly how long it's been running for, compares that time to different tasks, so I can easily spot things that might not be working. And it's worth noting that any code that we run inside of Kestra by default runs inside of a container to isolate it from other things. So here I can see my hello world message is successful, but we can also see that it pulled a Docker image. If I go to logs, I can easily just filter by the log levels there to make it a little bit easier for me to manage. Now in Jenkins, the way I would do this is by clicking new item. And when I do that, I am presented with a bunch of different options here. My understanding is a freestyle project is a little bit more kind of generic, general purpose, but what most people typically go for is a pipeline. So I'm going to be looking at pipelines and comparing those to Jenkins, especially because of how you configure them. Now let's just call this one hello. And I can click on pipeline here and press OK. Now here I can add descriptions and things, and there's a lot of different options here to build my workflow. Now something that's a little bit annoying is to actually configure this workflow, I have to scroll right to the bottom here where I'm presented with Groovy. Now Jenkins configures all of the pipelines using Groovy syntax rather than YAML like Kestra. Now each to their own. Groovy's fairly simple to understand like YAML, so this is more of a personal preference. And as you can see here, there is an example that I can easily pull in here that gives me an example of what my workflow could look like. And here it's just going to simply run a stage called Hello World using Echo. Now to do this in Python, the best way to do this would be to connect it to a Git repository that has my files inside of it and then pull those here. Now I won't show that in this simple example now because we're going to move on to that where we can bring in a Git repository. But for just being able to write your code directly in your workflow, Kestra definitely gets the mark here. But most people probably don't want to write it directly in the workflow. They'd rather write it in a separate Python file and pull it from a Git repository. Let's have a look at that in a second, but we're going to just quickly save this workflow and I can then run it by pressing this build now button. Now, when I do that, we can see that it then runs a build here in the corner, and I can see here it says hello world and finishes with success. Now, another kind of key comparison here is we've obviously got this Gantt chart that gives us all the logs. It helps filter it. Now, we'll look at some similar examples a little bit later on that show off this with different tasks, so it provides a little bit more value. Moving on to our first use case, let's have a look at how to do testing in Kestra. Here I've got a pre-made flow that I've just built. I'm going to clone our Git repository, and then it's going to run PyTest on some tests that we have inside of our Git repository. Now let's have a look at the Git repository to see the files we have. Now, just for this example, we've got a very simple Python script here that's got a function called add. It's going to take the two numbers and add them together. So let's have a look at the test file here, and we've got a few different examples here with one of them that doesn't work, but it's currently commented out. So we can use this to test the success and failure messages in both platforms. With that in mind, let's go back to Kestra and execute this and see this in action. Oh, and one last thing is at the end here, we've got a task that's going to send a Slack notification to us that tell us that the flow has successfully completed. Let's execute this and see this in action. So as we can see here, the Gantt chart is helping us visualize how long different tasks are taking and in which order they run. We can see it clones the Git repository, and then here it is going to run our PyTests like we can see here, and it's going to run that successfully. After that, it can then send us a message in Slack to say it was successful. Now in Jenkins, I've got a testing pipeline already. I've added my Git repository so I can easily access it. Scrolling down, we have no triggers or anything, but here is what my Groovy script looks like. Now, as you can see here, we are having to specify a Docker image here as our agent, specifically a Docker image with Python. Now, in Kestra, we didn't need to do this because we were able to use a Python task which uses a Docker image by default. And as you can see here, we're using a task runner, which by default, it runs on this Docker task runner. You can configure it to run in different ones, but this means the environment's all ready to go. In Kestra, we can run before commands here to install PyTest, and then we're able to just run commands like we would on our own machine. Now in Jenkins, what we do is very similar. We have a task here for checking out the repository, and we specified the branch as well. Then we need to create a virtual environment here, because the way Jenkins works is that you don't have permission to install your Python dependencies on the machine. So what you need to do is create that virtual environment, which is good practice to do on your local machine, and then install it into that. So as you can see here, I create the virtual environment, I activate it, and then I install it. Now it is still running inside of a container, this workflow, so there is still isolation in that regard, but you need to do the virtual environment too. Now that's where it gets a little bit confusing, because in Kestra, I don't need to do a virtual environment because this task is running in a container. You know, that provides the isolation that we need. If I wanted, I could change this to run on a sub-process of our Kestra instance and then set up a virtual environment with the before commands if I wanted to. I could also, instead of doing before commands, configure a container image which has my dependencies already built in, so I don't have to install them. Now, I could do this with Jenkins by specifying an image up here that has PyTest installed by building that separately, but again, it feels like an unnecessary step when it's already inside of a container. But regardless, we can do that here. Now, if I run this stage under here separately, I have to then reactivate that virtual environment, despite the fact that I already had activated it up here. So there's a little bit of repetition here, and then I'm able to run the PyTest. Afterwards, we have this post block here that's then going to send us a notification. Now, something that I think Jenkins does really nicely here is it gives me loads of different variables that I can use here, sort of like expressions here to get loads of different data. So here I can get current results, the job name, build number, build URL, which I think is really, really helpful to create rich notifications. In comparison, Kestra has the specific Slack execution task. There's a separate incoming webhook one for just sending any message you like. And this execution task will just send you sort of a brief on what's going on with your execution, but it doesn't necessarily give you that flexibility on what you can put in there. So I think Jenkins gets the leg up here for customization. Something else worth noting is this post block means this will run whether it's successful or fails, whereas the Kestra one here is just a task. So if this fails, this will not run. And so we'd have to specify this separately by using the errors block here, like so, but then this will not run if it's successful. So we'd have to have two separate tasks here to say the status. So again, another thing that I think Jenkins does quite nicely here is allows you to send that notification regardless, but then you can fetch with an expression what that result was. Just quite a nice way of doing it, in my opinion. Now, there is a way to be able to have global status notifications in Kestra as well. Instead of doing it inside of your workflow, you'll create a separate workflow, which we've called alerting here, that uses a flow trigger. And this basically means you can trigger this workflow based on conditions of other flows happening. I've got it here that if a flow execution status changes, as well as making sure it's in this specific namespace so that it doesn't just cause a loop of calling itself, this means I can get this Slack notification every time. So this means for failures, for success messages, this will do all of it. And that's also the really nice thing here is I can keep adding these conditions here to give me even more control and flexibility on exactly when I want these notifications to be sent. I do really like how Jenkins does this little post block at the end for any pipeline, but it's convenient to be able to set up a separate flow that manages all of that alerting too. So again, two different approaches, both have their advantages and disadvantages. Now we've got that, we can press the build now button here and we can then wait for it to appear here. And here we can see it is going to start to process. Now, I really like how when in Kestra I press execute, it immediately pulls me into an execution page where I can see all of the details and I get a nice Gantt chart that helps me visualize at what stage we're at. Here, I find it much harder to visualize at what stage we're at and what's happened so far. As you can see here, it doesn't make it very easy to filter between the logs and stuff looking at the console directly. And so I can actually see in here, that's where the PyTest is, but I do think that Kestra does a slightly nicer job here. If I just go back to that execution, I think Kestra does a much better job with the option to sort of change between the log levels. I can easily see per stage, or in task in this case, what's actually happening. So I think it does a much better job in that regard. As you can see here, both of our status notifications have successfully been sent. Now to begin with, we've got our Slack bot we created for Jenkins here. There's got a bunch of the variables that we put into our string message. So here we can see the status, the name of the pipeline, which number of execution this is, and a link to it as well. But in the Kestra side, we get a slightly nicer looking notification here, which has the same sort of information that we would expect. So both of them are displaying the same thing, again, with a link back to the platform so you can look into it. The key thing is this Kestra one here was done using a flow trigger, which is able to say the success message. Now, if we sent this as part of the flow, because the flow hasn't finished, it will say status running. So that's just something to bear in mind here. Now, something else that Jenkins does really nicely is the introduction of a Jenkins file. So as you could see when we go to configure and scroll down, there is an option here. There's an option here to have a pipeline script or a pipeline script from your source control management. So this means, as you can see here, I've configured this to pull directly from my Git repository, and then I've told it where the script is. And as we can see here, I have a Jenkins file here all ready to go with the exact same stuff as the previous one, but it's all inside of our repository. So we don't have to configure anything inside of Jenkins here for this to work. This will just automatically get the latest changes every time this is triggered. And we can configure how this is triggered using the build triggers here. So let's apply this and see what happens when we run this. So when I press build now, even though this has no pipeline syntax in here already, we can see that it's automatically cloning that repository. And then because it's cloned the repository, it has access to those files that we want to use. And as we can see here through all of the logs, it runs successfully. So this is a really nice way of being able to do the same thing here as we have here in our Groovy, but instead it's doing it with a Jenkins file. Now there are ways to do this with Kestra, but I think this is a really clean way of doing it directly with your repository. Now there are a few ways you can achieve this in Kestra. For example, this blueprint example that we have here uses the same clone method here, just like you would have seen in the previous one, but this is completely triggered using a webhook. So it's able to trigger that, and then it's able to run some of the server CLI commands in Kestra to add those as workflows directly to Kestra. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is by using the git sync flows and push flows method to be able to sync those flows directly into the Kestra instance so that you can use them. So here's that example where we're using sync flows here and sync namespace files to pull both the flows and the files we want to execute into Kestra automatically. And as you can see here, it's got a trigger that's going to pull that on a regular schedule, or we could manually execute it too. The thing that Jenkins removes is this still needs a workflow, whereas Jenkins doesn't because of the way it's configured. Some could say that's a good thing because here everything's a workflow. So if you can think of it, you've just got to build a workflow to manage that process. But at the same time, having it as a workflow means that now this has to live in Kestra, but you won't necessarily have that in the repository. There's a few things here you'd want to figure out. For example, I would leave this inside of my Git repository under the system namespace and leave it there to just manage my Kestra instance. The other advantage of doing this as a workflow means you can version control this and easily just add this and remove this from workflows, whereas Jenkins, having a lot of configurable options, I believe it gives you the option to export those settings and import them, but having it as a workflow means you can easily move this between Kestra instances and you'd be able to just recreate what you had with a few clicks. In our next example here, we are able to use a very similar setup to that testing flow for deploying to the cloud and just running on our instance. But instead of running PyTest here, we can specify a different command here to run our file. And this file is just a very simple hello world, which we can see here by running this, and we'll see in the logs here once it's cloned that it just says hello world. Now, it's worth noting that because we're using a task runner here, this allows us to be able to specify remote compute environments where we can execute this. And so there are supported task runners such as AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure. And so if I wanted to, I could easily specify this to run somewhere else just for this task, and it will spin up those resources on demand for us to do that too. As you can see from this blueprint example, I'm able to specify a number of variables that we can access for AWS, and then I just specify these under the task runner property. So this means I can easily just go, hey, this Python script, run that on AWS, everything else runs different places. So it makes it really easy to just be able to configure individual tasks without having to do crazy amounts of overhead. Now in Jenkins, I've got a deploying pipeline here already set up. Again, we can look at config, and here, very similar to what we did previously, I can create that virtual environment and then I can access it and simply just run my deploy bit here. And so when I press save here and then click build now, we can see that when it runs, it will be successful and it should appear here. And I can see that it's going to, no problem, finish successfully. So very, very convenient, and I can see that it's successful there. Now, Jenkins, similar to Kestra, does also allow you to run on remote environments. Jenkins now calls this an agent. So here I'm specifying this agent here to be a Python image in Docker. Guess you could think of this like one of our Docker task runners, for example. Now, to do this, you have to first of all install a plugin. And that's kind of the key thing I think that I taken away from Jenkins and Kestra is when you install Kestra, there are two options to install it. You have an option to install it with no plugins, just the core ones, bit like how Jenkins comes out of the box, or with all of the plugins. And for Kestra, there is over 500 plugins available. Now, Jenkins has been around a long time and there are hundreds and hundreds of plugins available. We can easily view these inside of Jenkins by going down to managing our plugins, which we can see here. I can easily click available plugins and I can search for anything I could desire. Now, more doesn't necessarily mean better. This means that you can get some really random things in there, things that maybe haven't been supported for years. For example, if I search Slack in here, we can see that some of this global Slack notifier that you might want to use for being able to notify across all of your workflows hasn't been updated. Well, it was released 5 years ago, but a few of these may not be safe to use and so on. So here I can click on this and see that it was released 6 years ago. When was the last time it was released? Yeah, no release for a long time. So while I really like the fact that in Jenkins, I can easily install plugins from the UI, but I don't have to. I can also do it manually if I want to as well. Kestra doesn't have that option. There is no plugins option in the UI other than to view what you have. If you want to install anything, you need to do that before you spin up Kestra, especially if you want to put your own custom plugin. but this is only for plugins that are pre-installed. Now you can see here, obviously Kestra's got plenty of plugins here that support all of the key things that you would want, and Jenkins is very much the same. But I do think Jenkins has a much better way for managing this. I can see that these are the ones I have installed. I can easily toggle them on and off. I can do all of this from the UI, which is really convenient, and I can uninstall them completely as well. Now to set up these remote agents that can be spun up on demand, we can go to the Manage Jenkins settings page, and here you'll see there are the option to add nodes and clouds. And that's something that Kestra and Jenkins both do very well, is being able to set up different ways to run it. Now, task runners or cloud agents in this scenario allow you to run that in specific pipelines or tasks in those remote environments. In Kestra, we also have a concept called worker groups, which will be similar to nodes that allow you to run on different nodes that might even be on different machines with different resources. Something that I found very beneficial with Jenkins in the past is I had a Linux instance and a Windows instance, and I needed to run the same thing on both to make sure it could build successfully on both platforms. And this is where I could have Jenkins as the host on one of them, and it could then trigger those remote units and be able to run the tasks and then pull it all into the same pipeline. So Jenkins does that very nicely. However, I should add, it's very fiddly to get set up. So while it does do it, it's not necessarily simple to get working. Now let's have a look at clouds here. So when I click clouds, we can see here I have the option to install a plugin and I can create a new cloud. Now I've installed an AWS plugin here already, and here I'm able to specify if I want to get the EC2, and I'm just going to call this AWS. When I press create, I can add my credentials in here, region, and so on, and it gives me a lot of configuration here to set this up. And again, that's another way of thinking. In Kestra, everything is done as a workflow. You can configure plugin defaults so you can get that same behavior across multiple flows, but in Jenkins, there's a lot more configuring of Jenkins behind the scenes that then means you get that sort of response from your workflows. So both of these can do both having different types of workers that process your tasks, but you can also have remote provisioned agents or task runners to be able to run things as you need and when you need. So both of these do this, but they both take different approaches in how you manage it. Here I have to fully set it up inside of Jenkins as a cloud, and then I can then access that. Whereas in Kestra, everything here is set up as part of the workflow, but then you can use plugin defaults to be able to have all of this data be the same for every single Python script task and to make sure they all run on AWS. We already mentioned about alerting, but alerting again is very similar. What I had to do was install a Slack plugin, which we can see here is available right at the bottom. As you can see here, I have my Slack plugin, and then I'm able to go into the system configuration and scroll all the way to the bottom to configure actually how that's going to work. And as you can see here, I have to specify an OAuth token as well as a few other bits of information to get that to work. So again, you configure that all centrally, whereas in Kestra, as we can see from our original example here, when I edit my workflow, this is just simply pulling a secret that I preset. And if I go to namespaces, this is where I get the option to add plugin defaults, variables that I want to access between multiple flows, as well as secrets. And as you can see here, I have my AWS secrets and my Slack webhook all ready to go here to be accessed in anything that's in this predefined namespace. We've talked about a bunch of different things you can do with both platforms, and as we've proven, both can do it, but they have different approaches to doing it. Now, I personally think that the Kestra approach is a little more modern and easier to use, and the use of the UI to be able to give you rich information about your execution statuses and how things are running is really, really helpful and something that could be really useful inside of Jenkins as well. Now, something that we haven't touched on is how do you trigger these workflows? That's the main reason we use these platforms, isn't just so we can click a button, we want these to run automatically. Now, Kestra has a concept called triggers, and triggers can come in all shapes and sizes. Now, let's jump back to one of our previous examples to have a look at that. Now, as you can see here, I have a trigger inside of this example workflow, and this is simply going to use a cron expression. Very simple, we want it to run every day, maybe we want it to run nightly, where it's going to do a bunch of processing. This is really, really simple. And we can actually run multiple triggers on a workflow. Maybe we want it to run at 2 different times a day, where maybe a cron expression can't quite express that all at the same time. We can actually have 2 different triggers and just keep specifying them, which is really, really convenient. And when we have these triggers set up, we can also access some of the data from them using expressions like we can see here with the outputs. So if we want to get the date of the trigger and things like that, we can do that too. But triggers aren't limited to just schedules. You can also create event-based triggers. Here we have an example of a trigger that's using a webhook. This means we can configure this flow to execute every time this webhook is triggered, which makes it very event-driven and means you can just sit back and let it work. This example is really cool because we can configure the webhook on GitHub. When GitHub is ready, it can then tell the workflow to run, and then the workflow will pull the data from GitHub and allow us to start processing it. So this is one way of doing that, but we also have a few other types of them, such as an S3 one that allows you to automatically run your workflow when new data arrives, as well as real-time ones that let you to stream data from things like Kafka, where as soon as that message arrives in your queue, you can already start to process it inside of Kestra. Something else that I think Kestra does really nicely is cron expressions don't necessarily give you the full flexibility you need. We also have trigger conditions, and so here's an example that uses a condition here to specify you only want the first Monday of each month to be actually triggered. So if this is something you want to run monthly, but specifically on Mondays, it gives you a little bit more flexibility that you might not get with a cron expression. So you get the best of both worlds here. Want a simple cron expression? You can do that in 3 lines of YAML. You want something a little bit more complex? That is available too. Now, Jenkins has obviously multiple ways to start your workflows as well. These are called build triggers. And as you can see here, you can have it to build periodically. This is very similar to our schedule trigger. Something that I think that's really nice about this schedule trigger is it actually tells us here to spread the load evenly. Now, this cron expression is saying to run it at 10 o'clock every day. But if you have all of your pipelines set to run at 10 o'clock every day, that means your Jenkins instance is going to be sat there with its feet up, not doing very much, and then all of a sudden, everything is running at the same time. Not great for performance. So what it's actually saying is if I use this H as a option here, it will then spread out some of those workflows to make sure that they aren't going to necessarily run all at the same time. But as you can see here, it's going to run this one a little bit later just to help spread them out to make sure they're not all running at the same time, but near enough, especially if you don't need it to run at that time. It's just a nightly job that you need it to run from 1 o'clock. Then you can specify this to run a little bit spread out just to spread out the load. I think that's really nice. You can also set up hook triggers. So this is kind of similar to the event-based stuff in Kestra, where you might want it to automatically trigger when GitHub has a new commit pushed, and then you can pull that change and have it run a bit like you would see in GitHub Actions automatically. So you get options like that, and you can poll external systems. Similar to being able to detect new files in S3, that is done on a polling schedule. So here, there are options to do that too. And there are loads of other different types of triggers that you can use to be able to have a pipeline trigger, another pipeline, and so on. But the thing is, it's all configured here in this configuration page. So while that can be quite useful, I quite like Kestra's approach of having everything inside of your workflow. So it's incredibly clear what the workflow is. Everything I need to know about it is right here in the file. There isn't extra information around that I might not know about. Because Kestra does everything as a workflow, something that I think is really nice is the option of a flow trigger. So this is a trigger that will get triggered based on other flows inside of Kestra. But specifically, this one will get triggered when a flow fails or finishes with a warning status. So this means we can set up global alerting for any errors using one workflow, which means if I want to turn this off, I can do that very easily as well. But here I'm able to send a Slack notification to tell me something's crashed, but I don't have to configure this for every single workflow. Now, Jenkins has similar ways of doing it, but I think that this solution is really clean, but it also gives you loads of flexibility because you don't have to just run a Slack notification. You can have an endless list of tasks there as well. So we've had a little look at a few different examples for both platforms and how they handle. Now, this is my takeaway on what each system does best. Now, Kestra does a really good job of building everything as a workflow, which means that it's really easy to see what's configured and where. There isn't separate settings pages that might be hiding information that is relevant to your workflow. Now, this makes it really easy to version control because everything is stored in your workflow. Something else I really like about Kestra is both its execution page and its logs page. Now let's have a quick look at that. I really love this Gantt chart. I think it makes it really easy to visualize what tasks are running when and which ones are grouped together. I also love the logs view as well. I think this is just a lot easier to use, easy to navigate with. I can easily jump between different options at the push of a button. And I think that this makes it much easier to debug your workflows. On the other hand, Jenkins does achieve the same things, it's just nowhere near as nice. Everything here is in the same color, it's not easy to see where the different groupings are, and this page doesn't open up either automatically when you execute. Something that Kestra does is the execution page comes up straight away when you press execute, whereas in Jenkins there's just a few extra clicks to make everything work. So again, just a thing that makes Kestra's experience a little bit smoother. Now when it comes to configuring these workflows, in Jenkins, we do everything in Groovy, and while Groovy is a personal preference, the editor that is built in by default to Jenkins isn't very useful. There is no autocomplete and there's a little bit of syntax highlighting, but the error handling is pretty minimal, which means that it's quite difficult to know why it might not be working, and it's easy to set up a workflow that might be prone to errors. Now in Kestra, the thing that makes it really nice is we have a fantastic autocomplete here that makes it really easy to be able to add new things in and be able to configure them correctly. And the other thing as well is if I add something here that is invalid, it will physically not let me save my workflow, which means I am unable to run a workflow that has invalid syntax. And to go with that development experience, the built-in documentation here at the side, every single time I click between different plugins, makes it just such a breeze to build workflows without having to jump between different tabs and figure out where you're even supposed to be looking. But when it comes to Git integration, being able to set your pipeline to pull from a Jenkins file with Jenkins and be able to then pull your repository and build it all like that is very nice if you want to be able to package it all together without having tons of different pipeline scripts. Whereas in Kestra, you'll have to set up some workflows to pull those into Kestra, and that can add a little bit more complexity, whereas this is a very simple setup for being able to get it up and running quite quickly. Alerting wise, I think that Kestra makes it just easier to be able to configure this, especially where you can use a flow trigger to configure this across all of your flows. And so this just means that you can set this up, version control it, and set up very specific conditions to get exactly what you're after. And again, without having to create a Slack app in the example we used earlier, this just makes development that little bit smoother over Jenkins. And there's a few other things about Kestra that make it really nice, such as the pre-built blueprint examples here that give you tons of ready-to-go examples built into the platform, as well as all of the plugins accessible here. Now, Jenkins does do a much better job here at being able to install your plugins, especially because some of these plugins do not need Jenkins to restart to add them, and you can easily manage them without having to do it from the terminal, which is really preferable for some users. Something else that I think is really powerful with Kestra is the ability to have multiple triggers here set up, not necessarily just schedules, but event-driven ones as well, and the ability to add a bunch of conditions too, like we saw earlier with that flow trigger. Jenkins has a lot of options too for triggers, but I think Kestra integrating it directly into your workflow is very, very convenient and makes development easier by keeping everything in the same place. And lastly, I think Kestra does a really nice job here with this dashboard view that tells you what's going on about all of your workflows. And you can easily filter this dashboard too to make it suit your needs. I think this is definitely a game changer in comparison to Jenkins. So to summarize, I think both platforms have their advantages and disadvantages. Now, Jenkins has been around for a long time and some could class it as a legacy system. And so with that in mind, I think Kestra, with a few modern ways of thinking and generally just a smoother development experience, I think that gets the win for me. Obviously, this will depend on your use cases. If you're keen to learn a little bit more about Kestra, you should check out some of the other YouTube videos on our channel where we cover all of the things to building workflows and how you can build complex use cases. If you have any thoughts, please do share them in the comments below. I'd love to understand why you're using Kestra or why you're using Jenkins. At the end of the day, we want to build a tool for you. And so if there's something that Jenkins does that is fundamental to you and you would love to see something similar from Kestra, but maybe with a more modern approach, then let us know because we'd love to learn from our community. Hopefully you found this video useful. Make sure to give us a star on GitHub and join our Slack community.